My husband and our surrogate plotted to steal my baby and fortune, but a DNA test revealed a shocking truth that ruined everything for them. I'm a 33-year-old woman, and this past week has been one of the absolute worst of my life. It feels like everything is falling apart, like I'm losing myself, losing my grip on reality. I have no idea what to do. I've been married to Bryce, who's 35, for 6 years now, and we've known each other for almost a decade. He meant everything to me. I loved him with all my heart. And yet, he betrayed me. Now, I don't know how to process anything anymore. I'm desperate for some advice on how to deal with this. I first met Bryce on a dating app almost 9 years ago when I was still in college. Funny enough, it wasn't even me who swiped right, it was one of my friends. At the time, I had just gotten out of a long and painful relationship, and honestly, I wasn't looking for anything serious. So when Bryce messaged me, I didn't think much of it. I replied mostly because he was cute and seemed like a nice guy. But before I knew it, he asked me out, and I agreed. To my surprise, I actually enjoyed his company. He was charming, funny, and easy to talk to. We started going on more dates, though I kept things casual. I was still healing, still wary of jumping into something new. Bryce understood where I was coming from. He never pushed me, never tried to rush anything. Instead, he became more of a friend than a romantic interest at first. I would vent to him about everything, especially my family, which I'll get to later. He was patient, always listening, always there for me. Over time, we started seeing each other almost every day, and despite telling myself I needed time to be single, I found myself falling for him hard. It wasn't planned, and I didn't even realize it was happening at first. But the way he was with me, his kindness and patience, it all just drew me in. Even though I knew he had feelings for me too, he never made a move because he respected that I wasn't ready. A year into our friendship, though, it was undeniable we were in love. He made me feel safe, happy, and truly cared for. And finally, when I felt secure enough, I was the one who asked him out. We made it official. My parents, however, weren't thrilled. Now, about my family, my dad was a businessman, with shares in multiple companies, including the family business that had been passed down for generations. We were well off, and I had grown up with a very comfortable life. It wasn't like I was spoiled, but I had never lacked for anything. My father had very clear expectations when it came to my future. He wanted me to marry a wealthy, well-educated man who could eventually take over the family business. Bryce, on the other hand, came from a completely different background. He had lost both his parents and was only left with his younger brother and grandmother. He never had the chance to go to college and was working as a waiter at the time, barely scraping by. None of that mattered to me, though. I loved him. He was my best friend, and he treated me better than anyone ever had. But my father? He couldn't stand the idea of us being together. He outright told me Bryce wasn't good enough, that I would regret it one day. He pointed out how Bryce had no career, no money, and no way to keep up with my lifestyle. I ignored him. Bryce and I stayed together despite his disapproval. Things got even worse when we got engaged. My father was furious. He knew he couldn't stop me, but he practically begged me to make Bryce sign a prenup. Honestly, the thought hadn't even crossed my mind. My father warned me that people would do anything for money, and that a prenup was just a precaution. I found it insulting that he thought my relationship with Bryce wasn't real, that Bryce was just in it for the money. It led to a massive argument between us, one so intense that my father even threatened to cut me out of his will if I didn't agree to a prenup. When I brought it up to Bryce, I told him I didn't care what my father thought. I loved him, and I knew our love was real. Bryce was just as offended as I was that my dad had even suggested it. But when I told him about my father's threats, he surprised me. He said he was willing to sign a prenup if it meant keeping the peace between my family and me. At the time, I thought it was the most selfless thing he could do. I agreed, and Bryce even helped me look into different types of prenups. There was one option where assets stayed separate for a set period before merging later. This kind of prenup ensured that neither person was just in it for financial gain. We settled on an 8-year agreement. After that, everything would be shared. It seemed like a perfect compromise, one that satisfied everyone. We got married after nearly 4 years of dating. My dad wasn't exactly happy about it, but eventually, he had to accept it. Bryce moved into my apartment, and for the first year, I covered everything: the rent, the bills, the groceries. I never minded. I knew he didn't have the means, and I never wanted to make him feel bad about it. I was making good money, and I could afford to handle it on my own. Bryce was still the same man I fell in love with, kind, patient, and understanding. He kept his job at the restaurant, and since he wasn't earning much, I also paid for most of our dates. Again, I didn't mind. I loved giving him things, especially knowing he'd had such a tough life. He never had much growing up, and I just wanted to take care of him. But then, after about 2 years of marriage, things started to shift. I assumed Bryce would eventually work towards something better, maybe try to land a higher paying job or at least take some online courses to build his skills. But instead, he seemed to lose all motivation. At one point, he even quit his job at the restaurant. I didn't want to put too much pressure on him, but at the same time, it was getting harder for me to handle everything alone. It wasn't just the money, he didn't help out around the house either. Most days, he'd just lounge around or go out, and I'd come home to find that he hadn't even bothered to cook a meal. I convinced myself that he was just feeling stuck, maybe going through a rough patch. After talking things over, we agreed to sign him up for an online finance diploma so he could start working toward a better future. Around the same time, I also started thinking seriously about having a baby. I had always dreamed of being a mother. I was an only child, and I knew I wanted a family of my own someday. More than anything, I had always dreamed of having a big, happy family. It felt like the right time to start trying, and I truly believed that having a baby on the way would also give Bryce the motivation to work harder. We tried for months, but nothing happened. No matter how much I willed it, I just couldn't seem to get pregnant. Eventually, we decided to get checked out, and that's when I received the kind of news no woman wants to hear. The doctors told me I had endometriosis and a blocked fallopian tube, something that explained the unbearable pain I'd had during my periods for years. It also meant that conceiving was going to be a much bigger challenge than I had ever imagined. That diagnosis shattered me. I felt broken, useless, like my body had failed me in the one thing I was supposed to be able to do. I spiraled into endless research, trying everything I could: supplements, strict diets, exercise regimens, anything that promised even the slightest increase in fertility. But no matter what I did, it never worked. As the months dragged on, I felt my hope slipping away. Bryce stood by me through it all. He never missed an appointment and supported me even on my worst days. He reminded me that, yes, he wanted to be a father, but not at the cost of my health. That should have comforted me, but instead, it made me feel even worse. Knowing how badly he wanted a child only added to my guilt. After a while, I decided I couldn't keep torturing myself like this. If it was meant to happen, it would happen naturally. I wouldn't keep punishing my body over it. And just when I had started to let go of the pressure, 3 months later, I got the news I had been waiting for: I was pregnant. I was in complete shock, unable to believe it was real. Bryce was over the moon, and my family was beyond thrilled. This would be the first grandchild for both sides, and it felt like everything was finally falling into place. We threw ourselves into preparing for the baby, shopping for clothes, setting up the nursery, buying toys, picturing what life would be like when we finally had our little one in our arms. But the happiness didn't last. At 5 months, I lost the baby. Even now, I can't bring myself to talk about the details, it's too painful. We were going to have a little boy. And just like that, he was gone. The grief was overwhelming, crushing, unlike anything I had ever felt before. I blamed myself, convinced that my body had failed him just like it had failed me before. For those few months, I had felt like a mother. I had imagined holding him, loving him, watching him grow. And in an instant, all of that was ripped away from me. I couldn't face the world. I stopped going to work for months. I couldn't even bring myself to step foot in the nursery we had prepared. Looking at it felt like reopening a wound that was already unbearable. And this, I think, is when things between Bryce and me started to shift. I withdrew from him completely. I know he was grieving too, but at that point, I could only focus on my own pain. He did his best to support me, to be there for me, but I pushed him away. I snapped at him, shut him out, lashed out when he was only trying to help. Looking back, I know I was being unfair. But in that moment, my grief consumed me, and I didn't know how to let anyone else in. It took months before I could even begin to process what had happened and reconnect with Bryce. But even then, something between us had changed. We spent the next year trying again, but nothing worked. I started to let go of the dream of becoming a mother. That's when Bryce brought up the idea of adoption. I had already thought about adoption before. There were so many children out there in need of loving parents, and I knew we could provide that. We had more than enough, and most of all, we wanted a child to love. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. So we started the adoption process. It was a long and difficult road, full of waiting, paperwork, and uncertainty. After months of searching, we were finally matched with a birth mother who was expecting twins. The moment we connected with her, everything felt right. She liked us immediately, and I couldn't help but feel hopeful. Twins. It felt like fate had finally smiled on us after everything we had been through. We began preparing all over again, this time making sure we had everything ready: the nursery, the clothes, the toys. We were ready to bring our babies home. But once again, our happiness was cut short. After the babies were born, the birth mother changed her mind. She decided to keep them. Hearing that news broke me in ways I didn't even think were possible. It felt like every ounce of hope I had left was crushed. I couldn't take another loss. It took me even longer to recover from that than the miscarriage. No matter what we did, it felt like the universe was telling us we weren't meant to be parents. And the worst part? I started blaming myself. Maybe it was my fault. Maybe I was cursed. I wasn't the only one who changed. I could see Bryce shifting too. By then, he had started working at a multinational company, and his finance diploma had finally paid off. He wasn't making as much as I was, but for the first time, he was contributing to the household. Still, our relationship wasn't the same. We had been through too much. The loss of the baby. The failed adoption. The heartbreak. It had taken an emotional toll on both of us, and even though it wasn't anything dramatic, I could feel us drifting apart. We weren't fighting or arguing, but we weren't really talking either. Instead of confronting the growing distance between us, we both just let it happen. We went through the motions, pretending things were normal, even as the gap between us kept getting wider. But about a year and a half ago, things started turning around for me. I threw myself into my work, and all that effort paid off. I landed a promotion. Bryce and I went out to celebrate, and for the first time in a long time, we had a good night together. We laughed, we talked, and for a moment, it felt like things were the way they used to be. And that's when Bryce brought up an idea I hadn't considered before: surrogacy. Back when we were first trying to have a baby, I had briefly considered surrogacy, but after everything I had been through, the heartbreak, the losses, the thought of trying again felt overwhelming. I just wasn't sure if I had the strength to go through another devastating disappointment. Surrogacy sounded like a promising option, but I didn't want to let myself hope too much, only to have it all come crashing down again. Bryce, on the other hand, was excited about the idea. He seemed so sure that this could be our answer, and I didn't have the heart to shut him down. Deep down, I feared it would all end in heartbreak, but I decided to give it one last shot. Over the next few weeks, we buried ourselves in research and finally made the decision to move forward. From the very start, I made it clear that my mental health was my top priority. I simply couldn't handle another devastating loss. Bryce understood and stepped up in a way I hadn't expected. He took on the entire process himself. He promised he'd handle everything: the paperwork, the interviews with potential surrogates, all of it, so that I wouldn't get too emotionally invested. I was beyond grateful to him for that. I reached out to my doctor, and they began prepping me for an egg retrieval. The process wasn't easy, being pumped full of hormones threw my emotions into chaos, and my mood swings were worse than ever. When they finally retrieved my eggs, they were fertilized with Bryce's sperm through IVF. After what felt like endless waiting and prayers, we received the news: out of everything, we had one viable embryo. A rainbow baby. Even with that glimmer of hope, I forced myself to stay guarded. I couldn't afford to get carried away, not after everything we had already been through. Around the same time, Bryce managed to find a surrogate. Her name was Melanie. She was 24 years old and willing to carry our baby. I wasn't involved in the selection process. Bryce insisted on handling it since I was already emotionally exhausted. But when he introduced me to her, I liked her immediately. He showed me all her medical records. She didn't smoke, didn't drink, and had passed all the necessary exams with the doctor's approval. When I finally got to talk to her, she shared that she was doing this because her mother was seriously ill and needed money for treatment. Melanie was working overtime while living in a hostel, sending every penny she could back home. Meanwhile, her younger sister was taking care of their mom. Hearing her story broke my heart. She wasn't just carrying our baby, she was struggling to keep her family afloat. I promised myself that I would do everything I could to help her, not just because she was giving me the greatest gift, but because she truly deserved it. We moved forward with the embryo transfer, and then came the agonizing wait. Typically, we would expect a positive pregnancy test within 15 days, but the days passed, and we heard nothing. My heart sank, but I kept praying. The doctor told us to wait a little longer before jumping to conclusions. Then, 2 weeks later, Melanie took a blood test and it was positive. She was pregnant. A month after that, we had our first ultrasound. The moment I saw my baby for the first time, I completely broke down. The technician did mention that the baby was measuring smaller than expected for its gestational age, but aside from that, everything looked fine. I clung to that small reassurance. We paid Melanie the first installment of her compensation, but she sent it right back to her mother. She confided in me that her mom would never accept the money if she knew it had come from surrogacy, which was why she was still staying in a hostel. That revelation hit me hard. I couldn't imagine the weight she was carrying alone. I brought the situation up to Bryce, suggesting that we have Melanie move in with us for the duration of her pregnancy. That way, she wouldn't have to worry about rent, and we could make sure she was eating well and getting the care she needed. Bryce immediately shot the idea down. He said it was better not to get too attached, that keeping our distance was the right thing to do. But I didn't give up. I kept pushing until he finally agreed. Once she moved in, Melanie and I became close. She wasn't just our surrogate, she became a friend. I was beyond grateful for what she was doing for us, so I did everything I could to support her. In addition to her agreed-upon payments, I secretly gave her extra money every month to help with her mom's treatment. I accompanied her to every doctor's appointment, made sure she was eating healthy, and encouraged her to stay active. But during all of this, I started noticing something strange. Bryce and Melanie always seemed a little off around each other, awkward, almost. They barely interacted when I was around, and on the rare occasions that they did, their conversations were quiet, stopping abruptly whenever I walked into the room. Then there was the way Bryce changed around her. He stopped being affectionate with me whenever she was nearby. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off, saying it was just weird for him knowing that another woman was carrying his child. And honestly, I got it. It was strange for me too, so I let it go. Before we knew it, 9 months had passed. The baby was still measuring small, but otherwise, everything looked fine. And then, finally, after nearly 43 weeks of pregnancy, our little miracle arrived. Wesley. The moment I held him in my arms, everything we had been through, all the pain, all the losses, all the waiting, felt worth it. He was perfect in every way. I was forever indebted to Melanie for making this possible. We brought Wesley home and began settling into life as new parents. It was everything I had ever dreamed of. Even the sleepless nights didn't bother me. I had my baby, and that was all that mattered. Bryce, on the other hand, seemed more preoccupied than ever. He had recently gotten a promotion and was working long hours, often staying late at the office or taking work calls in the middle of the night. At first, I tried to be understanding, but as the weeks passed, it started bothering me more and more. He barely spent any time with Wesley, and I wanted them to bond. Every time I brought it up, though, he would make excuses. Then, 4 months after Wesley was born, I had to go into the office for an important client meeting. It was a last-minute request, and I hated the idea of leaving Wesley, even just for a few hours. I insisted that Bryce stay home with him. After all, I didn't want to leave my baby with a stranger. He agreed without hesitation. I finished up my work earlier than expected and rushed home, eager to see my son. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. Wesley was in his crib, wailing. And Bryce? Nowhere to be found. Panic set in. I ran through the house, calling his name, but there was no answer. Then, when I reached our bedroom, I saw that the door was locked. I froze. From inside, I could hear voices, muffled, urgent. My heart started pounding as I banged on the door. It felt like forever before Bryce finally opened it, his face flushed, his eyes wide with panic. I pushed past him, searching the room. And that's when I saw her. Melanie, hiding under our bed. Everything clicked in an instant. The awkwardness. The whispers. The distance between Bryce and me. They were having an affair. Even though my mind screamed at me to deny it, the truth was right in front of me. Bryce stumbled over his words, trying to explain, swearing that it was a mistake, that it had never happened before. Melanie just stood there, ashamed, unable to look me in the eye. I had trusted them both. I had opened my heart and my home to Melanie, treated her like family. I had given Bryce everything he wanted. And this was how they repaid me. And worst of all? While they were betraying me, they had left my son, our son, crying alone downstairs, completely forgotten. I was absolutely disgusted. Without a second thought, I grabbed Wesley and drove straight to my parents' house. My hands were shaking the whole way there, my mind racing as I tried to process what I had just seen. When I arrived, I broke down and told my parents everything. As expected, Bryce came crawling back soon after, begging for my forgiveness, swearing it was a mistake. But I had been cheated on before, and I knew without a doubt that this was a deal-breaker. The fact that he had betrayed me with Melanie, of all people, made it cut even deeper. There was no coming back from this, no excuse that could make it better. I told him straight to his face I was done. I wanted a divorce. Bryce fell to his knees, crying, pleading with me not to go through with it. But my father wasn't having it. He called security and had him thrown out. A few weeks later, I contacted my lawyers and served Bryce the divorce papers. Since we had only been married for 7 years, the prenup was still valid, which meant he wasn't entitled to a single cent of my money. At that moment, I had never been more grateful to my father for insisting on the prenup. If it hadn't been in place, I would have lost half of everything to this lying, cheating man. When it came to custody, I initially believed that a 50-50 split was best. No matter how much I despised Bryce, I wanted Wesley to grow up with his father in his life. But Bryce had other plans. His entire personality shifted the moment he realized I was serious about the divorce. The tears, the begging, it all stopped. One evening, he called me, saying he wanted to meet to discuss the divorce terms. I agreed, thinking we could sort things out like adults. But when I arrived, my stomach dropped. Melanie was there with him. Bryce looked far too pleased with himself as he handed me a document outlining his terms. My blood ran cold as I read through it. He wanted full custody of Wesley. Not only that, but he claimed I was mentally unfit to care for our son. He accused me of suffering from frequent bouts of depression and even suggested I had borderline personality disorder. And as if that wasn't enough, he demanded $155,000 in monthly child support, claiming that Wesley was entitled to every penny I would inherit from my father's will. I was speechless. I refused, of course. There was no way in hell I was handing over my child to him, especially not after what he had done. That's when he smirked and told me the truth. This had all been part of his plan. Bryce admitted that he and Melanie had been together for 2 years. He had chosen her to be our surrogate, knowing full well that when the prenup expired after 8 years of marriage, he would leave me, be with her, and take half of my money with him. The only flaw in his plan was that I caught him before the 8 years were up. The prenup was still in effect, so now he had to try another way to get what he wanted. He figured that by painting me as unstable, he could take full custody of Wesley and drain me financially through child support. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Melanie had been in on this all along. Every moment I had spent caring for her, trusting her, supporting her, it was all a lie. Remember how she said her mother was sick? That was fake too. She had been taking the money I sent for medical bills and spending it on herself and Bryce. They had both played me for a fool. Through tears, I asked Bryce if I had ever meant anything to him. His response shattered me. He admitted that, at first, he did love me. But after we lost the baby, he lost interest. From that moment on, he was only staying with me for the money. His words hit me like a freight train. I took everything to my lawyers, and they assured me that what Bryce was demanding was outrageous. There was no way he would get full custody, and the child support he was requesting was laughable. They would fight for me with everything they had. Then, one of my lawyers suggested something that caught me off guard, a maternity test. I scoffed at the idea. Of course, Wesley was my son. My eggs had been used. The embryo was implanted in Melanie. I had carried this child in my heart long before he was born. There was no reason to doubt it. But my lawyers insisted. They wanted to be absolutely sure. So I agreed, even though it felt ridiculous. Days later, the results came in. And they made me collapse. The test showed that I was not Wesley's biological mother. I couldn't breathe. It didn't make sense. How was that even possible? My eggs had been used. I had undergone the entire IVF process. I had been there every step of the way. I confronted Bryce immediately, demanding an explanation. He fumbled for words, claiming it must have been a mistake. I refused to believe anything he said. My lawyers ordered another test just to be sure, and this time, we included samples from Bryce and Melanie too. I clung to the hope that this was all some horrible mix-up. A cruel joke. A clerical error. Anything but the truth. But then the final results came in. Wesley was Bryce's biological son. And Melanie was his biological mother. I was nothing to him. Legally, biologically, nothing. I felt like my entire world had been ripped apart. It took me days before I could even bring myself to write an update because putting it into words made it all feel too real. I spent every moment on the edge of breaking down, questioning everything. And then, finally, Bryce confessed. He told me everything. The IVF had failed. My embryo never resulted in a pregnancy. But Bryce knew me. He knew that if I found out, I wouldn't try again. And he couldn't let that happen because having a child with me was his golden ticket. His way to secure child support and a fortune from my family. So he and Melanie took matters into their own hands. While Melanie was still on fertility treatments, they tried naturally. And because of all the drugs in her system, she got pregnant almost instantly. That's why, when we first got a negative pregnancy test, it was real. There had been no pregnancy at that time. That's why the baby was always measuring small for his gestational age, because his actual conception date didn't match what we had been told. That's why Wesley was nearly 4 weeks overdue, because he wasn't conceived through IVF at all. My lawyers also went through all the paperwork Melanie had provided for the surrogacy, her background check, her medical history, everything. It was all fake. Bryce had fabricated the entire thing to convince me and the doctors that she was a legitimate surrogate. And the money? The money I had sent her to help her sick mother? Melanie's mom was alive and well. She had never been sick. The money had gone toward buying herself a brand new car. They had played me from the very beginning. I don't even know how to describe the pain I feel. I gave them everything. I trusted them. I loved my son more than life itself, and now I'm being told he was never mine to begin with. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to move forward. All I know is that I will fight for Wesley with everything I have. Because I might not be his biological mother, but I am his mother. I raised him. I held him. I loved him. And no piece of paper is going to change that. With everything that had happened, my lawyers wasted no time in building a strong case against Bryce. There was no way he was going to get custody of Wesley, even if he was biologically his son. The law was on my side, and I was ready to fight for my child with everything I had. In a surprising twist, Melanie separated from Bryce. She claimed she had no idea about his grand scheme and that he had taken advantage of her trust. According to her, he had promised her marriage and financial security, manipulating her into going along with the surrogacy even though she hadn't wanted to. She also claimed that he was the one who forged all the documents and had pressured her into lying about her mother's illness just to get more money from me. Melanie insisted that once the IVF failed, Bryce convinced her to conceive naturally, telling her it was the only way their plan would still work. Now, she said she wanted nothing to do with him or Wesley, she just wanted to leave this all behind and move on. I didn't know what to believe. On one hand, I knew how manipulative Bryce could be, I had fallen for his lies myself. Maybe Melanie was just another one of his victims. But on the other hand, she had been right there, involved in it all. Could she really have been oblivious the entire time? Bryce, of course, denied her claims and insisted that she had been in on it from the very beginning. But all the evidence pointed to him as the mastermind behind everything. As for me, it took a long time to come to terms with the fact that Wesley wasn't biologically mine. At first, I was terrified that I would lose him because of it. But now, with Melanie walking away and Bryce facing serious criminal charges, custody fell to me. Legally, I wasn't sure what that meant, but I was willing to fight for my son. Our divorce hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I braced myself for another battle. Update. Hey everyone, just wanted to clear a few things up. Surrogacy is completely legal in my country, but we have strict laws and regulations in place to prevent fraud. That's why the process takes so long, there's a lot of paperwork involved, and everything has to be verified. But what Bryce did, that was a crime. Forcing a woman into surrogacy against her will, forging documents, and manipulating the entire process, those were serious offenses. Melanie also claimed that Bryce had pressured her into carrying the baby even when she didn't want to. With all of this considered, the court sentenced Bryce to 8 years in prison. The trial dragged on for nearly 3 months, during which Bryce pleaded innocent to everything. He denied every accusation, clinging to his lies. But in the end, the evidence was stacked against him. When they offered him a reduced sentence 8 years instead of 12 if he confessed, he finally admitted to everything. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine I was married to such a vile, deceitful man. Looking back, I feel like I never really knew him at all. He deserves every second of his sentence, though I still think he should serve more time for what he did. A month ago, our divorce was officially finalized. Every single one of Bryce's plans backfired on him. Not only did he lose his bid for custody, but with Melanie out of the picture, I was granted full custody of Wesley. Yes, I may not be his biological mother, but my name is on his birth certificate. I was the first person to hold him, to love him. From the moment I knew he existed, I was his mother in every way that mattered. No court ruling, no DNA test, nothing could ever change that. The day the judge handed me full custody, I broke down in tears. I had been so afraid I would lose him forever. But now, he was safe. He was mine. Update. Wow, it's been a while. I just wanted to pop in to say hello and give a little update. Wesley and I are doing great. He turned 1 a few months ago, and we had the best time celebrating his birthday. Motherhood has been an incredible journey, and despite how painful our start was, I'm determined to give Wesley the best life possible. Bryce is still in jail, and I haven't heard a word from Melanie since everything was settled. Honestly, I don't care to. That chapter of my life is over. I'm doing my best to move forward, to focus on the happiness that Wesley brings me every day. Life still feels surreal sometimes, but we have to keep moving, keep healing, and hope for better days ahead. And as long as I have Wesley, I know I'll be okay.